Whoever feels qualified to answer.
To do that.
Chair
I can
Pavley,
do
let me
some
note
of
that
those,
we're
but
10
I'll-
minutes over. Well, let me try to respond as briefly as I can. First of all, on the issue of storage, as we've previously acknowledged, we all believe as part of the administration that increases in surface storage and groundwater storage are important as part of a comprehensive plan for California's water future. The legislation that was passed by the legislature and approved by the voters on this $2.7 billion is about as much complexity as anybody could jam into 3 or 4 pages of legislation. I would suggest anybody that's interested in it take a very close look at it. You'll probably have to read it about a dozen times before it starts to make sense, but it gives the Water Commission very clear marching orders for how it is to spend those dollars in return for securing public benefits that can be provided by these water storage projects.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but is that outside of legislative oversight? They can do that without the legislature to disperse those funds for projects?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Not that there wasn't plenty of oversight given to creating the legislation, years and years of oversight in drafting the legislation, but the funds are continuously appropriated, which makes it the clearest path forward on spending of any of the dollars that are in the water bond. As to whether or not there are shelf-ready projects, certainly there are any number of projects that have been studied for years and a great amount of information developed on the attributes and costs and benefits of those projects. I'd say none of them are ready to be submitted to the Water Commission at this point. First of all, the Water Commission, per the legislation, has to go through a fairly extensive, complicated rule-setting process to define how the public benefits will be measured and compared once there are multiple projects that need to be competitively vetted. That's a complex process. It'll involve input from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, from the State Water Board, and others. The statute calls for that rule-setting process to be completed by the end of December 2016. Which will indeed, despite that seeming like a long way off, be a hard push to get that complicated process completed in that time.
You're optimistic we'll make that deadline?
I am. In the meantime, the local proponents of those projects have still a lot of work to do for themselves, even to the extent that they have highly studied projects, because another requirement in Proposition 1 is that the local cost share portion of any project that's brought forward have commitments for 75% of the required funding. There's no shelf-ready project that has commitments for 75% of the funding at this point, so that's going to take a lot of community work to get to the point that those sorts of financing plans can be developed. So we're on the track, but it's going to be hard and complicated and a lot of work to be done in the next couple of years before we see any of that money flowing. To the tunnel project, yes, we are pursuing conveyance fixes as well as ecosystem improvements for the Bay Delta, which Director Bonham may want to speak to. Still part of the California Water Action Plan. A couple of weeks ago, Governor Brown announced our new approach to completing the planning and implementation of both the Delta conveyance improvements and ecosystem habitat improvements. We'll have no doubt have continued debate over those programs, but the administration holds that those improvements in conveyance are an essential element in restoring the Delta and securing our broader water supply reliability.
So, Senator Stone, if I could say one thing about storage. So as director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, I understand that our water future involves above ground, below ground storage and connectivity and better what's called conjunctive use, toggling between each in a strategic sense to manage for beneficial uses. And I'm pushing myself to continue to think that way. What I hope is that you might be willing to think outside the box as well on storage. Our biggest reservoir are our headwaters, the Sierra Nevadas and the Cascades. They're degraded. So the California Water Action Plan says my department will restore 10,000 acres of those headwaters before this administration's done. We intend to do that. That's our biggest reservoir. By restoring mountain meadows, you can actually increase water quality, reduce sediment load into downstream reservoirs, better control fire risk, improve habitat for native trout species. That's an example of many multiple beneficial uses, and that's a way in which we're trying to think about our Prop 1 granting, achieving that kind of result.
Okay, if we could have our last questioner here, is that?
Director Bonham, you just brought up a great point. I had two questions, if I may, but how do you restore that? Can you give me just some
examples
so I can go home and tell everybody how?
Sure. Over time, sometimes, not a great sentence. As time has
Start well for you, so go ahead.
As time has passed, many of our rivers and streams and creeks have become narrowed or incised or straightened, and a restoration tactic can be riparian plantings to create shade and cover, a physical reconstruction to allow a more natural meander across a meadow rather than an incised straight channel, all of which can contribute to a different, what's called geomorphology, that slows water down, dissipates energy, reduces flood risk, allows water to percolate on the floodplain and create water quality benefit. So you can actually physically restore a stream channel, taking a look at its sediment load, its riparian bank condition, and then physically manipulating that environment to create a more natural state, which is good for quality, quantity, flood control, and species.
Okay. And then, again, hopefully this doesn't go, this drought continues and continues, but you were talking about people working together and adjusting their flows to run later for the late summer and fall runs. If this does continue, and even coming into this summer, I know you've got federal law and state law that you have to adhere to, but is it sustainable? Are we creating a sustainable environment? If we didn't have storage, how much water would be running down that river in late fall and summer? Are we using stored water to enhance an environment or a salmon run or any kind of fish there that normally, if it was natural, we had a natural flow coming out of the mountains and no storage, would those fish have to stay somewhere else? Would the birds move? But I know you're constrained by certain federal and state laws, but can you talk about that a little bit? And are you looking forward to, if this continues, some of these fall and late summer runs are, if it was natural, they would go somewhere else for at least a year or two?
So there's a lot in that question. Let me start by saying, for me personally, some of this drought has raised an existential threat, and it wakes me up in the middle of the evening, particularly those terrestrial species that can't migrate well from harm. But I also have been involved in water issues around the West for over a decade with landowners, and I know there are often ways to improve supply that benefits fish species. For example, the Water Board and I have done a program in the North Coast where we're willing to expedite the permitting of off-stream storage in rural residential landscapes in exchange for the individual not trying to divert in the summer when it's very scarce, so that the new off-stream storage can capture the high-flow rain, sit on it, and use it in the summer. That's an exchange of consideration, if you will, that works both ways, and the same theory applies for larger storage. I think there is sharing of the pain going on, even though I understand many of your constituents think the equilibrium is slanted one direction. We have reduced delta outflows by 30% in the last year. If you take a look at the San Joaquin River, we've cut those flows by about 65% for the period of February through June. I don't feel good about that, but I also acknowledge this period of drought is going to require all of us to make it through it together, and each of us are going to have to suffer in that sense. So.
These are all good questions. I want to thank all four of you for your continued efforts on behalf of Californians everywhere. We appreciate you. Thank you. And we're going on to panel 2. I know we're running late, but this has been actually timely and fascinating. Senator Woke will be chairing this segment,
Madam
the
Chair.
hearing.
All right, thank you, Senator.
And while they're coming up, we're going to, Senator Waso isn't here, but Senator Stone will be leaving. I'd like to lift the call on the Huff bill, Senate Bill 218.
Aye.
Okay. Lifting the call.
The current vote is 1 to 2, with the chair voting no. Senator Stone?
Aye.
Stone, aye. Allen? Hertzberg? Hueso? Jackson? Monning?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, we are going to close the roll on that vote. The motion fails. Senator Huff asked for reconsideration, and we'll grant if there's no objection. Thank you. Senator Wolf.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Fran. We have a wonderful panel in front of us. What else might be done? We'll start first. I believe each of you has about 10 minutes, but I'd like to just suggest that if it's a little bit less, that gives us more time to talk, which is where the more interesting conversation takes place. Ellen Hannock, Senior Fellow and Center Director, Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Let's see. It should just go? Got me? Okay. I have a couple of handouts for you, and I'm going to just tell you what they are, and then I'm going to run through something pretty quickly. So a little slide deck.
They're coming around right now.
And then which summarizes a short report that we came out with in mid-March, which drew on input from state and local leaders, including a legislative panel at a conference in January. And that the point of that was to sort of look at what the lessons are to date in how we've been getting through this drought, think about what we can do in the near term and over the longer term. So the ideas that are in here are familiar to a large extent, and I think a lot of them are reflected in the executive order. A lot of them are reflected in the letter that the Senate Democrats sent to the governor. So what I'm just going to do is highlight some things that I think are worth noting that maybe are not necessarily being talked about in exactly the same way. We highlighted 4 main priorities. This is page 3 of the slides. One of them you've heard a lot about, especially from Felicia Marcus, chair of the state board, the idea of information. This was something that you highlighted in the legislative letter as well. The idea of managing water more tightly with better information. The second one is setting clear priorities, objectives, and expectations, and this is really about water rights and the administration of water rights. The third is about promoting reasonable use and robust supplies, and the fourth is modernizing environmental drought management. And I think on the first one, on the idea of managing water more tightly with better information, this is the idea you can't manage what you don't measure. A lot of progress has been made. This started really with the 2009 legislation that helped set the stage. A lot has happened since the January 2014 emergency drought declaration. What I think we need to think about as we're thinking about information is being strategic. Some things we don't measure, but it's not as important to measure as other things. And for example, submetering in apartment buildings is in places where there's not a lot of water use to begin with is probably not a good investment compared to using I'd rather see the state use those dollars for improving our state information systems. And when we think about that, it's not just collecting the information, but it's also how do we organize it so that it is transparent and usable. And right now, we kind of are collecting it in some different places in different ways and really putting, there was a comment about kind of using the innovation economy that California has and kind of harnessing that, thinking about how we set up our state data systems for state-level information about water would be a really good way to get some thinking in from Silicon Valley and other places, I would say, the big data folks. I think in terms of what's missing, what we're not collecting, one thing that we point out, in addition to getting the information on diversions and who's using what, is also information on discharges. And this is really important in some of our systems where, in parts of in the San Joaquin Valley, some of those rivers, by the time you get a certain way down, a huge part of what's being used is actually discharges going back into the river. So, you can get that to some extent by improving our stream gauge measurements and sort of the technology of actual measurement in the rivers, but we already do collect information on urban discharges. It happens to be from wastewater plants rather than from urban water suppliers often, but that information is there, consolidating that, and then getting information on discharges from big ag users, where it's typically in a point location. It's not sort of just running off fields and into rivers. So that would be helpful. It would help us have a more fair and transparent way of dealing with curtailments and making sure that we get as real time as possible in knowing what's in the system so that people can use it when it is there. Second, the discussion that you all had about water rights, I think is relevant, this idea of setting clear priorities, objectives, and expectations. In addition to our seniority system, which is a bedrock of our water law, we do have legal reasons for also considering other things, and that can include public health and safety as well as the environment. And that's been considered informally in some respects up till now in this drought, but we think that there may be some value in the state board setting some explicit priorities about that. And I'll just note that Australia did do that, the state of Victoria did that during their drought, just in terms of sort of some guidelines on what were the expectations in relation to public health and safety, and that could be useful. Third, a lot of different recommendations that we recommended and that are sort of underway in terms of managing demand or promoting reasonable use and robust supplies. I think the couple that I would just highlight here on water transfers, the more we get better information about who's using what and the water rights, the more that's going to help our water transfer system. I think that there are ways in which the state could get better already now on some of the things that the Department of Water Resources is responsible for in terms of guidelines for what water can be transferred. I think we can go further. I think also that the state may have a role in encouraging local agencies that are unenthusiastic about allowing their members, especially irrigation districts, to transfer water in a drought, really ask the question, is that reasonable to just sort of say, no, the water has to stay within this irrigation district? And that's the kind of thing that I know is contentious, but probably worth asking in terms of, is that a reasonable use of water to just say, we're a senior right holder and it's got to stay here. I agree with what was said earlier about the sustainable groundwater management law, that the more we can provide state incentives and help to get that implemented, the better it is. And that will actually facilitate, for ag, that's actually key. Because it'll facilitate the ability to trade groundwater within basins, which is going to be a really useful thing for farmers, I think, as the drought wears on. And then the last thing that I'll point out is the one that I think is something that people looking at Australia have not noticed as much as and maybe some of the other things that the Australians have done in terms of water marketing and water rights and so on, and that is the approach to environmental drought management. So this is summarized on page 7 of my slides here. And what they did during their drought, in the midst of their drought, I think is something really useful for us to think about in terms of stepping beyond the really very important efforts that are already being made on behalf of by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, working with other agencies, and that is to really develop a strategic plan, watershed by watershed, for what do you do when you really have scarce water available, and how do you be strategic about the watering? And I think some of the things that Director Bonham mentioned about how can you be collaborative with other right holders and water users is a part of it, but also where does the state strategically aim to put its water, and how does it use dollars to help with complementary measures, which could include some infrastructure habitat, but also it could include buying water.
Ellen, I'll ask you to sum up.
Yeah. So this is just a map here for you of an example of what the Australians did after 1 year of effort in this way in Northern Victoria, sort of where they did strategic watering. And I think that that's something that we should aim for and you could ask for. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Lester Snow, who's the Executive Director of the California Water Foundation. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's apparent to all of us that we have an order of magnitude greater attention on water than we normally have, probably greater than an order of magnitude. And even from the earlier discussion, I think it's clear to all of us we've got to seize the moment. And the one tragedy of this drought would be to come out of it without fundamental policy reform. And that means we just would be getting ready to do the same thing over again with the next drought. A couple of thoughts. I mean, one, the real kind of negative thing going on that I want to draw attention to and then concisely get to some things going forward. If you read the paper, it would appear, some comments in the paper, we ban almonds, we kill the Delta smelt, and our water problems are gone. And wouldn't that be nice? And then, of course, the other image in the paper is we crowdsource a pipeline to the Northwest or the Great Lakes and all our problems. These are actually very devastating kinds of images to lay out to the public because it kind of conveys there is some really easy single-shot fixes, and there aren't. We need to fundamentally change the way that we manage water in California, and we've been lulled into a false sense of security because of this massive investment in infrastructure over the last 100 years, and it has benefited us greatly. And now it's time to change the way that we do business. I'll mention just 3 categories of kind of activity. One is—
I would just like to add, said the former director of the Department of Water Resources.
Yeah, I'm a former many things.
Yes.
Just call me former.
Just saying, you wear some hats here that maybe people don't realize.
The infrastructure investment, this means going beyond the bond, and it deals a little bit of what I said about being lulled into a false sense of security by the big projects. A devastating 4th year of drought, and meanwhile, we're going to discharge 1.5 million acre-feet of wastewater into the ocean this year. That simply has to stop. Whether it's purple pipe, indirect potable, direct potable, we have to stop. We have to invest in that. Stormwater, while you see different numbers on this, and Madeline may address this, but somewhere between 500,000 and nearly 1 million acre-feet of stormwater we could be capturing. Ag efficiency, we have some of the highest and most efficient agriculture in the world in California, but not everywhere in California, and we need to be investing further in that. And on the conveyance side that I'll go to, we need to be maximizing groundwater recharge. We just passed a law that wanted to bring basins into balance. Groundwater continues to be one of our biggest drought buffers. People turn to groundwater in a drought. We need to bring those basins into balance, and we need to grab wet year water and get it in our groundwater basins. If we build surface storage that isn't connected to recharging groundwater, I consider that a failure. We need to, any storage has to have as a component of it recharging our groundwater basins that are much larger basins and larger potential than anything we could do with surface water. Second category is funding. The bond is not sufficient. It's a nice start. So several things I'll mention. 218 reform. We've been reading a lot about that, and I think there needs to be a focused look at how do we make sure that these broader portfolio approaches to water don't get caught up in a 218 issue? And I'm mindful, I was at a conference yesterday where Senator Hertzberg cautioned against the difficult politics of 218, and I'm very mindful of that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it and see what can be done on it. Also, I think there needs to be something called a Drought Recovery and Preparedness Fund, funded by water users. And so maybe that's another way of saying a water fee, but something that's dedicated to this issue.
Though. It works. Say it again, Drought Recovery and...
A Drought Recovery and Preparedness Fund. I'll come up with others if that's helpful, too.
That's good.
It's all about messaging.
And then on to the policy. This has already come up with the market transfer system. We need a much better, transparent way for people moving water around. That means, as everybody's already identified, a much better a data system, a better monitoring system, so you know who has water, who can transfer water, where it's going, how much. I think it addresses so many issues, including a clearer transfer system would be easier to provide in-stream flows at the right location at the right time. That's very challenging now. Also under policy, show me the water. Higher standards for new water demand, and I unfortunately forgot the Senate bill number. I refer to it as the Sheila Kuehl bill. 500 units needs to pass a test on water availability. I think we need to look at lowering the threshold of how many units triggers the requirements, and I think we need to tighten up the requirements. The other one that was discussed a moment ago and significantly discussed, new wells that bring new land into production, high capacity, bring a new permanent demand onto the system in critically overdrafted basins. In the ag community, I hear people refer to this as investor orchards. They're not even local farmers. They're bringing new land into production in highly overdrafted basins. I think we need to consider adding specific criteria to well drilling permits. As you may know, the primary purpose of getting a permit to drill a well is public health protection and making sure you're not introducing contaminants to the aquifer. Perhaps there also needs to be criteria and support for those counties that are taking action under their well drilling permit authority. And then two final things that I'll mention. Consideration of modifying 375 to SB 375 to include in what is an acceptable sustainable community strategy a water element. That it doesn't have to condition anybody's transportation funding. I understand vehicle miles traveled is a primary purpose of that. It certainly would be nice as regions are making decisions about which land use strategy is best that they look at a water footprint with that. And final is an issue of we still have housing stock with old appliances, with old toilets and high-flow shower heads. And I think we need to move more effectively on that, not only with rebates and incentives, but probably a retrofit on resale kind of bill so that we're making faster progress on replacing those old appliances. And that's probably enough to irritate quite a few people. So.
A lot of good ideas.
A lot of good ideas, definitely. Thank you, Lester. Madeline Glickfeld, who is the director of the UCLA Water Resources Group. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and the rest of the committee. So I'm going to go as quickly as I can, being the last of a very long hearing. I have three ideas that I wanted to put forward to you, and I'm going to spend almost all of my time on the third idea.
And we have your,
and you have this. So one of my first recommendations is that despite the fact that Felicia is the chief state nag on water, and she's doing an incredible job of it, people, especially in Southern California, where I'm coming from, really still don't completely get it at all. They don't get where we are right now, that there is only X amount of, we know how much water there is, and we don't have enough to spare. The idea is that we need to get to be someplace beyond the finger pointing, which I see very much coming in Southern California, saying, why should I take shorter showers when there are people in the Imperial Valley growing alfalfa, when there are people doing this, when there are and why don't you just condemn their water rights? You know, I just think people don't understand the reality of the situation.
It's not only Southern California.
Yeah, it's a big problem. And I think more importantly, I don't think when you see my presentation this time, you'll see that there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of small water providers that are not capable of delivering the conservation tools or the conservation message, and that they need tremendous amounts of help, because they're the ones that are talking to the consumer about, all right, you have to cut 36%. Well, they say, what should I do? And they don't know. So I think we need to get there. The second thing is not a minor thing. We absolutely have to deal with Prop 218, which basically says You can't charge people more than water costs, and it costs from getting it point A to point B. Can't do that. If you are going to install recycled water in a water basin that you can store for the benefit of all of the users, you can't charge the users that are not going to get those recycled water. You can't put purple pipe out there and give it to someone else. So it's really got a stranglehold on us. And I think that one of the things that 218 doesn't recognize is water scarcity. And I think it has to recognize that water is scarce, and that the big users and the small users are different, and that if people are going to use water, we shouldn't have to basically fine everyone for wasting water. We should charge them for wasting water so that they decide not to. And I think that's important. So the rest of my presentation to you today is about plumbing. That's what my big thing is, about plumbing. So there's a water efficiency in some places is talked to about how the consumer can become more efficient. And nobody really talks about how is the retailer, from the point in which they purchase or pump water, how are they storing it, how are they getting it to the consumer, and how much are they losing along the way? And so if we could go quickly through my presentation, you'll see the first thing is a big blowout, which was shown nationally on the radio. We lost in LA, right over UCLA. It drowned our parking lots in Poly Pavilion in just, I would say, 10 million gallons of water in 2 days that they couldn't stop. It's 2% of the water use for 3.4 million customers went that day. So the question is, if they can't maintain their distribution systems, how can people conserve, and what do we know about how retailers are using their systems? Second thing I show you is that there were 206 leaks and breaks over 4 years in a very small section of Hollywood, and that it's not just Los Angeles, but any area that has older systems, and that's a good part of our state now. We always think of ourselves still as the new West, but we're really becoming the older West, just like us baby boomers. And we need to start thinking about how to do this. So what do we know about what these retailers are doing? So this terrible chart in here, if you look at the second category, it's reports that are required only every 5 years of water retailers over 3,000 connections. And one of the things it says is it says system losses. And I want you to keep that in mind. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a whole area called non-revenue water. It includes all kinds of things. It includes unmetered, unbilled uses, like if you are a city and you don't charge yourself money to water your park. It includes inaccuracies in billing. It includes unmetered uses. It includes, so what it doesn't narrow down to is what I showed in the red is real losses.